Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're here with another YouTube video to help you improve your chess game. Today we're going to look at king safety. When I do the 4 evaluation criteria, I name them material, king safety, activity, and pawn structure, sort of in that order. So king safety is extremely important. And when you're playing opening, you always want to keep in mind, where's a good place to tick off my king for the middle game? But when I ask my students, especially my lower rated students, what is it that makes a king safe or unsafe? The most common answer I get is, the pawns are not moved in front of the king. And that kind of thinking is exacerbated by one of the big weaknesses in a book I recommend, which is Logical Chess Move by Irving Chernev. And Chernev is extremely harsh on what he would consider unnecessary pawn moves in front of a castled king, saying they create weaknesses in targets. And of course, in a lot of cases that's true, and he picks out examples where that's more true than otherwise. But if you read other authors, they're not nearly so hard. And if you give positions to engines in the opening where they play moves like h3 or something like that, a lot of times the engine's going to say that that move is perfectly okay. So you don't want to waste time playing h3, stopping a pin that's not important. But on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily weaken your king that much. It's more that it loses tempos than it weakens your king that causes the problem. All right, so I like to use the following position as an example. This is a position where the material is roughly even. Both sides have one queen. Both sides have for the second white queen, black has 2 rooks, and for the third white queen, black has 8 pawns. So we have one queen against one queen against 2 rooks, and one queen against 8 pawns, roughly even in material. And we're going to put the white king all the way up in the middle of the board among all the black pawns. And we're going to even make it black's turn. And the question is, which king is safer? Well, if we use the criteria for, which king has lost its containment more, then it's clear black's 3 pawns in front of his king haven't moved at all, and the white king has no pawns at all in the middle of the board. And if we use that kind of criteria for king safety, then it should be clear that the white king is unsafer, and also it's black's move, and black can start doing things to the white king. However, that's not the real criteria you should use. The real criteria you should use for king safety is not how much protection your king has. Those things are important, and they can add up to a lot during a game. But it really all boils down to one thing, which is how well can the opponent attack the king. And in this position, with the black pieces kind of off in the corner and the 3 white queens having semi-open files toward the black king, if we make the position black's move here, black's pretty helpless against the 3 queens. For instance, suppose black plays c6 check. Well, that allows white to do a sneaky pin. He plays queen takes c6, threatening mate on b7, and it's pretty obvious that white's winning right away. But if black doesn't play that check, what can he do to try to get his pieces in the game? Let's say he plays g6 to try to bring the queen out. In positions like this, you can just sacrifice a queen. In fact, you can sacrifice any of your queens pretty much in this position. For instance, let's say you play queen takes b7 check, king takes, and we ask the engine, what now? The engine says mate in 3, check, king here, check. And if the king tries to run away, then queen takes checkmate. So does black have any defenses here? If he plays b6 right away, queen takes a7, king takes, queen takes check, and no matter where the king goes, we've got something like checkmate coming up here. And in fact, if you look underneath, let me bring up the engine's analysis. It's black's move, but you can see the engine says no matter what move black plays in this position, white has a mate in 4 or less. So clearly by that criteria, the white king is much, much, much safer than the black king, because the black king is exposed to attacks from the 3 queens, even though it's his turn. So the white king is much, much, much safer. But suppose we do nothing to the general structure of the position, and all we do is switch the queen on g8 h8 with the rook on g8. And we play queen g8, rook h8, like that. And now we make it black's move again. Okay, and now it's interesting. I give my students this position, and I say, well, what would black play here? And the overwhelming majority of my students rated under 1500 say, well, black could probably play f6 here at check and chase the king around the board. And that's true, and we can play f6 check here, and we could see what the evaluation is. Mr. Engine, what do you think? The engine says white should play king e4, black should play queen e6, white should play the very strange move queen to g1, queen to c4 check, king f3, a6. I've never done this one before. Queen on a to b2, e4 check, king e3, queen d5 guarding the mate, queen b3 trying to get rid of the guard, queen takes b3, queen takes b3, rook e8, queen a1, rook e5, queen takes a6, b6, queen f7, rook a5, queen a c4, rook c5, queen d4, and we're not going to go any further, but here it says that white is ahead by 5 pawns. Actually, in this case, both kings are relatively safe. Nobody's getting checkmated in their future. It's just that having traded off the one set of queens for the rook and the pawn, for the queen and the pawn, black just has a bunch of vulnerable pawns that are hard to defend here. And so in a sense, both kings are equally safe, but if we play another 60 moves, they're not, because if white's up by 5 pawns, that means eventually white's going to win, and the only way white's eventually going to win is eventually he checkmates. And whenever you're up by 5 pawns, if you're playing perfectly, eventually your opponent's king is going to be the less safe one, no matter what it looks like on the board at the moment. Okay, so if we go back to the start, yes, f6 is a candidate move, but so are all the checks. Well, what are the other checks that black has? He still could play c6 check, but he could also play f5 check, and it turns out that that's the move that all the good players say instantly. They say, oh, I'll just play f5 checkmate. And it's kind of interesting that people would see f6, but they don't see f5, even though f5 guards the key e4 square and actually mates in one move. So if it's black's move in this position, then black is clearly better because he's mating in one, and clearly the white king is the one that's less safe. But to show you how dynamically interesting that is, let's say that's what's true if it's black's move. He has mate in one. But let's say it's white's move. Let's change the position and say, Mr. Engine, it's white's move. What are you going to do now? And the engine says, oh, I still have that same mate I had before. Queen takes check, king takes, and now he likes the sacrifice. Queen a6 check, king takes a6, and the cute move king c6, getting out of all the checks and threatening queen a3 or queen a1 mate. And there's no defense. For instance, king to a5, queen to a3 guards the b4 square and his mate. So in this position, if it's black's move, black has mate in 1. If it's white's move, white has mate in 4. So if we ask you who has the safer king here, the right answer is whoever has the move has the safer king, because the other side can checkmate him. We could create a trivial example of this too. This is a pretty trivial example, but we could do an even more trivial one. Let's show you the difference between static and dynamic evaluation. All right, let's do this. All right, and now I'm going to ask you, which king is safer? And the answer is, if you don't know whose move it is, then each king is equally safe, because if it's white's move, then white will take the queen and black's king will eventually get checkmated. And if it's black's move, then black will take the queen and white's king will be eventually checkmated. But if you don't know whose move it is and we have to flip a coin to figure out, then they have equal chances of getting a heads or tails. And the two kings are equally safe, but in actuality, one of them is completely safe and the other's not. It's sort of like Schrodinger's cat in physics. We know one of the two kings is dead. We just don't know which one it is until we flip the coin. So probability has to decide which king is safer here. But statically, they look exactly the same. And, of course, we could put more pawns on the board for one side or the other. Let's say we give white 3 pawns here and now say which king is safer. And the answer is that doesn't change anything at all. If it's white's move, he's still going to play queen takes d8 check. If it's black's move, he's still going to play queen takes d1 mate. And having those 3 extra pawns to shield your king has nothing to do with the king's safety. So we're always talking about, which king is safer based on the ability for the opponent to attack the king. Let's look at a bishop g4 kind of opening in a double queen pawn game. All right, so let's say, I'm just making this up on the fly as we go along. Let's say we have d4, d6, knight f3, bishop g4, c4, should we do e6 or c6? We'll do c6. c6, pawn takes, we'll waste a move or two here. e3, h6, knight c3, and I don't know, let's play knight f6. And now white can play queen b3, attacking the pawn on b7. So let's ask Stockfish. Okay, so you can see the evaluation. I brought it up. And in this position, black could play bishop takes f3, but then queen takes b7. And if the knight guards, then white, in fact, doesn't even take the bishop. He plays knight to b5, threatening here. Rook guards that, and now g takes f3. So when I get to positions like this in a game, and I suggest that white should play queen to b3, the answer people almost inevitably give me is you can't do that because bishop takes f3 will mess up the kingside pawns, and then the king is not safe. But you can see down here that Stockfish says that queen b3 is white's best move. And that's not coincidence that it's his best move. And the evaluation is about 1.2 pawns. So if white's better by 1.2 pawns against queen b3, whenever you have the advantage, to some extent we could also translate that by what we said earlier, that to some extent your king is safer when you have the advantage, because if your king was so unsafe that your opponent could take advantage of it, then eventually that would be to his advantage with your exposed king. So just for the fun of it, let's play queen b3, and instead of playing the number 1 move queen b8, we'll play that bishop f3, and instead of playing the number 1 queen b7, which is plus 2.8, let's let black defend against that by simply recapturing on f3. Okay, well now white's advantage obviously has gone down, but it isn't negative. In fact, it's still greater than the average advantage that he would have in an opening. A typical opening advantage is about 2/10 of a pawn, and here white's up by about 3/10 of a pawn. So it's not like after bishop takes f3 that white's king is completely unsafe now, and that white's in big trouble. And in fact, later on in the game, depending on what happens, white might even be able to castle kingside here. If he can't castle kingside, he could leave his king in the center. He could castle queenside. But in any case, his king's going to be able to find some shelter. So again, we see this dynamism where, white's active army and his more pawns in the center more than make up for the fact that there's some holes in his pawn structure, and therefore the king has a little bit less safe places to go in the middle game. Now, does that mean you can't play this poorly and end up getting checkmated? Well, of course you can. In fact, if you'd like to see an earlier video where I talk about this, do a search on my YouTube channel, Dan Heisman Chess, for the Maung lesson, M-A-U-N-G, Maung, M-A-U-N-G lesson. And there I talk about the fact that if you push a pawn in front of your king and you win a piece, and then later on you get checkmated because you played terribly, it wasn't the fact that you pushed the pawn in front of your king and won a piece that was the problem. The problem was that you were up a piece, and instead of using that extra piece to win the game, you overlooked your opponent checkmating you and lost the game. It wasn't the weakening the king that lost it. It just made it so that you had to be a little bit more careful. But being up a piece was certainly worth it. All right, let's look at one more example. This is from a novice nook I wrote many years ago called When is the King Safe? And in that novice nook, I talk about a lot of the things I talked about in the first 15 minutes of this video. And let's hit it up here. There we go. Okay, so we have kind of a Nimzo-Indian kind of position. Let me make the board bigger here. All right, and we have a Nimzo-Indian kind of position where white has played the break move f4, and black ignored the break move and allowed white to play f5. And in this position, the question I ask people is, what should white do? And what happens when I give this to people of different levels is kind of interesting. If I give it to people of lower levels, they understand they have the bishop pair, they're trying to do something with white's space advantage, but they're not quite sure how they should play. And if I ask them, is the right idea to push the pawns in front of the king, like g4 and h4 and things like that, they say, well, that's very aggressive, but I wouldn't do it because, my king's going to be exposed and I'm going to be in trouble. Well, I also gave this position to a FIDE master who was rated in the 2300s. And I said, white to play, what would you do? And he says, wow, this is a really good position. He said, I guess I would play g4. It took him all of like 5 seconds. And he says, yeah, I'm going to play g4. And what's happening here is black has no counterplay in the center. Black can't easily break open the queen side and play over there. And white's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces right behind these pawns coming up. And black's king is going to be all squished by these pawns coming up the board. And white just has a big attack here, and black is in trouble and has to play some defense with those pawns coming down the board. So the move g4 doesn't actually make the white king weaker. It makes the white king stronger. What's my logic? Well, by logically carrying out the correct attack on the black king, this gives white the best winning chances. And because white's attack is so strong here, this gives him a very good chance to win the game on the king side. And of course, if he can win the game on the king side, then his king is ultimately safe. So the fact that he's actually taking some of the pawns away from the defense of his king actually makes his king safer, even though it, quote, exposes the king. Let's give the position to Stockfish 14, which I've never done. I have no idea what he's going to say here, and see what the top moves are. Aha! Now, I have given this to its predecessor. I probably gave this, when I did the Novice Nook years ago, I probably gave this to Houdini or to Ribka or whoever was the top engine at the time when I wrote the Novice Nook. But, yeah, so I'm not surprised that Stockfish agrees with them. And the move that the FM said he would play, g4, is the number one move. And look at the evaluation. The evaluation is 3.1. Well, that means that both sides played perfectly, that white should just be winning this game. And if white's winning the game, of course, eventually, as we said earlier, that means in order to finish him off, eventually he's got to checkmate him. And to checkmate him, that means his king's got to be less safe. So if we play the move that gives us the biggest advantage here, that means, in a sense, that our king is the most safe. Let's see what the second best move is. The second best move is to play h4, which also pushes the... Let's see what the number one move is that doesn't involve pushing a pawn in front of the king. We've got number 3 is queen f3. But if you look at the queen f3 line, the second move after queen f3 is g4. So the only reason why queen f3 is so good is because you're going to be pushing those pawns on the next move anyway. So we'd have to go way down the list to find a sequence where white's not pushing the pawns at all, because that's, as the FM said, that's what white's got to do here, and that's how he's going to be able to win the game. Just for the fun of it, let's just show the top move here, and let's only play the best move for both sides for a while, and let's see what happens to the safety of the two kings. g4, knight on 8 to d7, h4, g6, knight to g2, bringing the knight over that way, rook g8, trying to neutralize the file. There's the rook on the same line with the king. White says, go ahead, g5. Black says, I'll blockade with my knight. White says, okay, I can run my king out of here if I need to. King f2. Black says, boy, I'm in trouble. Bishop c8. White says, I'll neutralize your rook with my rook. Black says, let's get ready for some queenside action with rook b8. White says, no you don't, I'll play a4. Black says, all right, then I'll use the rook for defense along the 7th rank. White says, let's put my rook on the same line with your king. Black plays queen e8. White says, let's get the other rook over there. Black says, I'm in a little trouble. Let's play, well, first he said king h8, now he says a6. White moves the king onto the f file. Black says, I got to get some play. b5. A takes b5. A takes b5. White ignores him with knight e3. Maybe coming in knight g4 in some lines. Queen e7. Bishop e2, keeping an eye on that knight. B takes c4. White plays knight g4. It's getting crowded around that black king. Black says, oh good, I want a pawn. I can bring my rook up. White says, yes you can. Rook says, I'll hit this pawn. White says, all right, I'll trade you your h pawn for my c pawn. But now my queen is guarding the c pawn. Black says, oh, let's play over there. Bishop e3, unguarding the c pawn. Rook takes c3. White says, I'll grab that file. Rook a1. Rook f8. King g1. Bishop d7. White finally cashes in with the space with f6. Queen d8. Queen f2. Rook c2. Queen e1. We don't want to do this too long, but and now Stockfish is saying, he was saying for a second that Black should give up the rook for that bishop. Now he says he can get away with rook b2. Rook h2. White's lead is around 3.5. Now he's still saying rook takes e2. I guess the threat here is to play bishop takes h5 and open up the king side. Black says, I can't allow that. Rook takes. Queen c7. Rook e8. Ironically, White's going to penetrate on the queen side. Bishop a4, offering 2 pieces for the rook. White says, no thanks, I'll play here first. Rook b8. Queen e2. Rook b7. Rook a3. A lot of these are computer moves that humans wouldn't be able to find. Queen c8. Ooh, Benoni jump. Knight f5. Well, it's not a real Benoni jump because if he takes queen h5, check is murder. Just getting the knight back into the attack. Queen to b8. Bishop c1. Not sure why. Maybe to guard the b2 square against knight moves. Bishop d7. And now he wants to put the knight back on h6. That's pretty funny. Knight h6. All right. Well, you get the idea. The knight can always come back in the game through g4 and e3 probably. White is up by 3.8. So obviously Black's been defending like a 3,500 player here. But White's still winning, and we don't see Black's pieces. After all these moves, we played 30 moves, and none of these Black pieces are really harassing the king at the moment. So the White king, even though he's exposed, if White plays correctly, he's exposed, but he's safe. And of course, that's the whole idea of the video, is a king is only as unsafe as the opponent's ability to attack it. Or you could say a king is only as safe as the opponent's inability to attack it. And that's the real criteria. All the other things about exposing the king and pushing up the pawns, they may contribute or they may not. As we saw at the start of this example, White pushing up the pawns exposes the king, but by giving him that good attack, it actually makes the Black king much less safe than the White king. So relatively, the White king is better off when he pushes those pawns with g4, as you see, which is number 1 move. Okay, so in today's video, we've tried to talk about what makes a king safe. And there's a lot of issues with king safety, and they're very important, but you want to understand them. You don't want to just kind of do the simplistic thing and say, a king is safe if all the pawns in front of him hasn't moved, and a king is not safe if you push the pawns in front of him. That could be well true, and it might be the most important thing in your position, or it could be completely unimportant. But to use that as the sole criteria, that's going to lead you down the wrong path. And the more you understand things rather than just kind of rotely memorize things, the better off you're going to be. So today, king safety. If you liked today's video, you could hit the like button. But the best thing you can do is tell your friends your chess friends about my YouTube channel, Dan Heisman Chess. I appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed, you can do that too. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.